for hosting this, for putting it all together, for bringing in the book. Absolutely. Thanks for everyone for coming, for your interest in the book and hearing me speak for a little while. Hopefully you won't fall asleep while I read a bit from the book. It's pretty cool now, after having worked on these topics for, I started writing about tech and transportation in 2015. I started a master's on this topic in, yeah, totally. Good.
Let's make sure people at home can hear you.
Sounds good. Is that?
All
Oh,
right,
wow. Okay. But yeah, so I started a master's, looking at this topic, digging into this in 2018, and then when I finished it in 2020, some people mentioned this might make a good book, and so I figured, yeah, let's do it. Verso was interested, luckily, so we went ahead. I started writing it in 2021. Went through some writing, some editing processes, all those sorts of fun publishing things, I guess. The usual timeline for publishing. And now it exists. It's out there. So, yeah, very cool. Thank you. So, I've picked a part of the book. Initially I was going to read the introduction. I was like, it brings people into the book, gives you the basics of what it is. But then I decided, no, maybe some people have read that already. And, I think that there's another part of the book that's pretty topical for the moment, given how, gas prices are quite high right now. People are talking about whether it makes sense to still have a transportation system that's so based on, cars and forcing people to drive in this way, and whether, there should be more alternatives for people. So just give me a second to find the page. All right, so this starts with a little bit from an author that I really like, Ursula K. Le Guin, fiction author. Thank you. Yeah, big fan, read a ton of her stuff. If you haven't read Ursula K. Le Guin, highly recommend picking up some of her fiction, but also nonfiction. She's fantastic. So I'll get started, and hopefully you enjoy this bit from the book. Ursula K. Le Guin had a unique way of telling a great story that forced us to confront contradictions in the way our society is organized. She believed that empowering people to use their imaginations to think of a better world was dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary. And she showed this to be true through her fiction. I'm just going to move this a little bit. In 1976, Le Guin published a coming-of-age novel called Very Far Away from Anywhere Else that explicitly engaged with questions of mobility and the place of the automobile in American society. The protagonist of the novel was a teenage boy living in suburbia who was figuring out his identity and finding that it clashed with the prevailing wisdom in his community. In an internal monologue, he explained, quote, "I didn't know who I was, but I knew one thing. I wasn't the seat fixture of an automobile," end quote. He saw himself as someone who preferred to take the bus and to walk because, quote, "I really like the streets of the city, the sidewalks, the buildings, the people you pass, not the brake lights on the back of the car in front of yours," end quote. But he was having an altogether different identity thrust upon him. For his birthday, his father had gifted him a car, and he deeply resented it. Quote, "You see, in giving me that car, my father was saying, this is what I want you to be, a normal, car-loving American teenager. And by giving it to me, he had made it impossible for me to say what I wanted to say, which was that I had finally realized that's what I wasn't, and was never going to be, and I needed help finding out what I was instead. But to say that now, I had to say, take your present back. I don't want it. And I couldn't," end quote. In his view, foisting a car upon him was also part of a larger pattern of pushing a particular idea of masculinity that did not define him. His parents were engaging in an unconscious process that happens every single day when parents normalize the existing social conditions and downplay the harms that accompany them to their children. But in this case, it was not working, and that may have been a reflection of the broader social dynamics playing out in the mid-1970s. 3 years earlier, the world had experienced the first oil shocks of that decade. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo on the countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. But it also caused the price of oil to soar, even for countries that were not embargoed. The high oil price and limited supplies naturally had wide-ranging impacts, and that included how automobiles could be used, if they were used at all. On January 2nd, 1974, President Richard Nixon signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act, which set wait now, I lost my place. Which set highway speed limits at 55 miles per hour, an act that was not repealed until 1995. But due to the high energy prices that resulted from the embargo, much more changed. Americans, along with people in other Western countries, became more concerned with energy use, and that was reflected in how people lived. Rather than big gas-guzzling vehicles, U.S. drivers began switching to fuel-efficient Japanese cars, and there was a push to increase the efficiency of engines after the introduction of fuel economy standards in 1975. By 1983, the New York Times was reporting that people had been using their bikes instead of their cars and going on walks to relieve their stress instead of taking long drives. People also wanted to economize on heating costs, which led them to keep their homes cooler in the winter and warmer in the summer, and the size of new homes actually shrank. The oil shocks of the 1970s presented a rare opportunity for the United States to rethink how it used energy in planned communities. President Jimmy Carter, who was inaugurated in January 1977, put solar panels on the White House and invested federal funds into developing renewable energy. But the change did not take hold, as anyone can see if they visit U.S. towns or cities today, where most people continue to depend on cars and trucks, not so much out of choice, but necessity. Rather than entrenching and learning from the changes that took place in the 1970s, U.S. corporate interests rejected them and doubled down on automobiles and fossil fuels. The United States extracted more oil and gas at home and launched new wars to ensure foreign supplies were not disrupted. By the 1990s, some people were abandoning fuel-efficient cars, once again, for sport utility vehicles, in part because they were subject to less stringent fuel economy standards. In Texas, there was a major push to invest in coal instead of renewables in the aftermath of the oil shocks, and it even had the support of President Carter. Instead of doubling down on suburbia and automobility, the United States could have taken another path. The path taken by parts of Europe. By the 1970s, the automobile was taking hold in Western Europe. The post-war reconstruction and economic expansion began the process of remaking European cities for the automobile by turning public spaces into parking lots, shifting street space to cars, and even leveling neighborhoods to remake them for the automobile. Europe had not adopted personal vehicles to the same degree as the United States, but the post-war period presented various corporate interests with the opportunity to imitate a process similar to that which was ongoing in the United States and from which they could profit immensely. But they ran into trouble. Road deaths in Europe, especially among children and young women, soared as automobile adoption increased, similar to what had happened in the United States a few decades earlier. Amsterdam, which today is known as a bicycle mecca, was not spared from this desire to transform and modernize by making way for the car. And by 1971, 3,300 people were killed annually by cars, including 400 children. In 1975, the traffic death rate in the Netherlands was 20% higher than in the United States. Naturally, residents demanded action. Among the groups that were formed to oppose the remaking of the city for the automobile was Stop der Kindermoord, which translated to Stop the Child Murder. The group's name was reminiscent of the evocative language that was seen on U.S. streets in the 1910s and 1920s. Its members had demonstrations for bicycles, closed roads to allow children to play, and even occupied the sites of car crashes. They gained the ear of people in power, then received public funding, and helped to develop policies to de-emphasize the automobile's place in Dutch transport policy. The growing death toll was one reason for the shift, but the oil shocks also played an important role in building momentum. After oil prices soared in 1973, the Dutch Prime Minister asked citizens to change the way they lived so they could conserve energy, and Sundays became car-free days. Those experiences affected policy decisions, and by the 1980s, Dutch cities and towns were promoting bicycle use by giving them dedicated lanes and redesigning streets to reduce vehicle speeds. Meanwhile, across the continent, governments were promoting energy efficiency, and European automakers were building smaller, more efficient vehicles. Decades later, per capita energy use is lower in Europe than the United States. Vehicles and homes are smaller, transit use is higher, and the automobile has not been adopted with the same fervor as in North America. The United States could have taken its foot off the pedal of auto-oriented development in the 1970s. In November 1972, the governor of Texas even called out the wasteful energy use in every segment of our society. But instead, it shifted into higher gear as soon as the crisis had passed, with a major suburban expansion through the 1980s and 1990s at great environmental and human cost. So that's the end of this section that I'm going to read for you all. And certainly the book is focused very much on the United States, but I think you can very much see how some of the things talked about in that section also apply to Canada as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Paris. We're gonna ask some questions. So I'm gonna get us started, and then we'll open up to the audience and to the live stream. So if anyone wants to start thinking about what you're gonna ask, let's go. All right, Paris. So, technology has brought us so many luxuries. It's improved our lives in so many ways. How can we say that we shouldn't trust it?
It's a great question. I get it a lot. Especially since I host the podcast called Tech Won't Save Us.
Woo!
Thank you. I think it's really interesting, right? And in talking about how technology doesn't deliver all these benefits that we often assume, it's not to say that technology provides no benefits at all, right? We can certainly see in many ways how new medications like COVID vaccines have been very beneficial to us, how there are many other ways that technology has improved. But rather, in taking a critical light and casting a critical gaze on technology, the goal is to say that we can't simply accept that simply because a new technology exists, that it's automatically going to bring progress, right? Which is often the narrative that we receive. But it's really to say that we need to look at the technologies, to think about how the technologies benefit us, and to think about the trade-offs that come with adopting new technologies. And that one of the problems that I think is that recently, especially in the past couple of decades, we've tended to accept a lot of technologies that are not benefiting us in a lot of ways. If we look at, for example, Uber, which is one of the companies that I talk about in the book, this ride-hailing company where, it supposedly offered you this opportunity to hail a taxi cab from your smartphone. Certainly it was convenient for certain people, but it came along with these promises that it was going to reduce traffic congestion in cities, improve the environmental impact of the transportation system, serve the underserved in these communities, and certainly many other things, complement public transit, for example. But then if we actually look at the studies that were done, years down the road, to actually see what the impact of this new technology, so to speak, was, it was to make traffic worse in major cities in the US, Canada, around the world. Not so much to serve the underserved, but rather to serve young people who are college educated, earning above average income in cities, who I generally tend to say, they're your tech workers, right? The people who are developing this are the people who are benefiting from it. It took people away from transit services, so it made them less convenient, took revenue away from them, so it hurt transit services. It was found to be worse for the environment than the types of transportation that it replaced. And so, that really says that when we think about these technologies that come along, we need to think more critically about what the impact of them are, if we're actually benefiting from them, or if it's just these corporations that are, putting them out into society that are really having the benefits.
All right, thank you. So, public transit, that might work in big cities, but, here in little Newfoundland, how could we really have that?
It's a good question. I recently talked to CBCNL about this, actually, I guess a couple months ago. I think the reality is that we need to recognize that there are other ways to put a transportation system together, right? To think about who benefits from a transportation system, to see where we allocate funding, to see where we allocate road space even. And so, when we look at what we have right now, certainly we have a bus service in the city, but many people would say that, it's not nearly as frequent as it would need to be. It's not as reliable. It's frequently delayed, doesn't arrive on time. those are things that can be improved, right? When we look at the city itself, one of the problems that we have is the lack of funding, but also, how there's just so many cars on the road. Maybe if you improve the transit service, you could take some of those cars off the road, and so then, it would work a bit better for everybody, not even just for the transit users, for the drivers who are still on the road as well. But I would say, too, if we think about how transit is necessary within the city, right, which is certainly an obvious thing, that's not to say that people in rural areas don't deserve good transit services as well. And that should be part of the conversation too, because in many rural areas, if you don't have a car, it's really hard to get around. Same as if you live in many of the suburbs in St. John's and beyond. And so there's a need to think about different ways of approaching these issues. And pulling from the section of the book that I just read, we're really in this moment with gas prices so high, with these questions around the transportation system that we've built. Does it really make sense to still be effectively forcing people to be reliant on a car? Or, do we start to think about different ways to direct our investments, to have the provincial government really support transit services across the province, not just so that rural communities can have, maybe it's not going to be a dedicated bus service, maybe it's some sort of on-demand service because it works better in places that are more spread out with smaller populations. Other provinces, other countries have already dealt with these questions. We can certainly learn from them. But then also to think, especially right now, we're in the summer, we have a lot of tourists who are, in the province who are trying to get around. We see every year the stories about the lack of rental cars, how it's so difficult for tourists to get around. Maybe if we had a proper intercity bus service or intertown bus service, interprovincial bus service that went across the province, it would be much easier for people to actually visit different parts of the province instead of having to rely on a rental car. And that is something that the provincial government should be working on as well.
All right, thank you. Last question from me. Your reading did allude to some ways that we could advocate for public transit, but yeah, if folks were keen on public transit, what are some ways you think that you can make that push happen?
I feel like that's a question that maybe you should answer. Or Mark, of course, or so many other people here who really do that work much more than I do. I would say one of the things that was fascinating to me in going back and looking at the history of automobility and the rollout of the automobile within, the North American city, but even globally, right, was really to see how, right now the automobile has been normalized, right? Everyone needs to have one, you need to rely on them, it's everywhere. This is just the way that things are, right? And it has been for generations, so we should get used to it. But then, when you go back, especially in North America, to the 1910s, the 1920s, when the automobile was really rolling out, you see how the automobile was entering this streetscape where there were a whole different set of norms, right? The way that the street operated was much different than it is today. You had people walking, you had people on bikes, you had people on streetcars, horse-drawn carriages even, and then the automobile comes along and it doesn't fit within those norms. It's not slow, it starts to go a bit faster, it presents a danger to the people on the streets. And so all of those other modes, all those people using the streets had to be pushed off to make way for the automobile. And looking back now, we can think, this is just the natural development, right? There's this new technology that's created, rolls out on the road, we start to transform how we live, completely natural. But when you go back and look at what happens in that period, it's not exactly how it works, right? There are a lot of people who are opposed to this change, because especially when we think of the automobile in that period, it's a luxury product. Not very many people own them. And so the people who are benefiting are a small portion of society, and there are a lot of people who are not benefiting, right? Who are actually being killed or maimed or hurt in other ways. And people do organize to push back on that. People have funeral parades for people who died on the streets to draw attention to the fact that, people are dying, children and young women in particular, and this is seen as unacceptable, rightfully so. And people ring the bells of churches and fire halls when people die to draw attention to the fact that has happened. Posters are put up calling the car the modern mullet. And there's one that particularly sticks with me of a little girl pulling on her mom's skirt and being like, when is daddy coming home? But daddy isn't coming home because he's been killed by one of these new automobiles, right? And you can see how evocative it was for people in that time. And unfortunately, they kind of lost that battle. The automobile did take over because there were a lot of commercial interests that were backing it. The auto companies, the oil companies, the suppliers to the auto companies, and on, who saw a lot of profit opportunity in making these changes and getting the government on side. And I would say, also drawing from the 1970s, which I read about in that portion of the book, we also see in Europe how people were effective in pushing back against the entrenchment of the automobile, right? In actually doing public protest, in finding ways to draw attention to the fact that the automobile was having these effects on the community, and taking advantage of that moment that they had as well, right? Where energy prices were high, where there was an opportunity to really get people to think differently, to get the government to take different policies, and luckily they were successful then. I think during the pandemic we had a moment where we were discussing whether this was going to be a moment where we would think differently about transportation, right? And think differently about our cities more generally. Here we experimented for the first time in many decades with a pedestrian law, for example, and that is stuck. And so what other opportunities or what other events can we take advantage of to try to draw attention to these changes and to try to get people to think differently about how the city can operate? So I guess that's what I think of.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to open it up to the floor. Questions, comments, do you agree, do you disagree? You can come up to the mic and rant, or you can just raise your hand. And
can I take down my mask?
Yeah.
I'll just move it so I have a
You
little
want the microphone?
from everybody. Sure. Like, what's this thing from sitting? First of all, thank you so much for the reading. It was awesome. And thank you so much for the book. I have a question, and I'm wondering if you've come across any conversation around this in your research and in your writing. So just as you just mentioned the downtown pedestrian mall in St. John's, which is a bit of a double-edged sword because it is a beautiful pedestrian and community experience for anybody who walks and moves through the world in a very typical way. But for people who have disabilities, it is a very kind of in-our-face example of how marginalized we have become when it comes to public access. And a lot of the issues that we have around that particular aspect of marginalization does, for sure, track back to this kind of automobile-centric culture that we live in. Sidewalks get narrower and narrower, narrower and narrower, while roads get wider and wider. Speed limits they hover at a place really where a collision with a pedestrian will have a fatal outcome for the pedestrian, and so on and so on. Public transit here is not accessible in most cases. There is no interconnectivity between communities, so we who have disabilities and financial circumstances arising from that disability that kind of make cars just way beyond our resources anyway, right? Like, I live in a province that celebrates our proximity to the water and our beautiful natural environment, yet I and many other people I know who do not have the ability or the capacity in any way to drive, I cannot access a beach, right? I have not been to a beach in years in St. John's, right? And I have privilege in this community because I'm not on income support. You know what I mean? I'm not sort of hostage to that poverty aspect, but I don't like the resources that I would need to move freely and safely through the city firstly and through the province secondly, like are way above my financial capacity. So that's one piece. The second piece is that, again, addressing new technologies, which I think are amazing in a lot of respects for people who require them. The one technology that was adapted by the city very recently to provide a little more safe passage through that downtown pedestrian mall for people who live with sight loss requires that you have an iPhone to interact with it. And if you don't have an iPhone, like it's not Android compatible, so if you don't own this expensive phone and have capacity to pay mobile data charges, like we are now in a situation in St. John's where people who have this particular disability are actually having to invest in technology to interact with the technology that the city has decided is going to be the accommodation. Yet we do not have the financial resources to do that, and we have become the only people in the public realm who actually now are out of pocket to access a space that everybody else gets for free. So there's like, when we talk about this kind of mobility justice, mobility/disability justice, I feel that even though we have our theories, like we're still working through our theories really well, I still feel that disability issues are maybe not being overlooked, but I don't think maybe looked into deeply enough. And I also think that whenever any municipality decides on anything without consultation with the end user and without consideration of the context of those people's lives, what the context of those people's lives are, right, just coming into the conversation, then it's a mess. And it's always a mess. Am I the first person, or like, have you been privy to other conversations and comments of this nature? Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks so much, Anne. I completely agree with you. I think that, I guess just touching on your point about the technology, right? I think that there's a serious issue when it comes to adopting these technologies, and there's often this kind of assumption built into it on the first hand, as you were saying, that everyone has a smartphone, that everyone can access these things, that this is just something that everyone has these days. They have mobile data; it's not a problem, right? And we just saw recently with the Rogers outage how fragile that infrastructure is. But then on top of that, how expensive it is something that we all know, right? That we've all been dealing with for ages. And then I think on top of that, I would also say, one of the things that strikes me, and that I talk about in the book, is that, especially when it comes to transportation, and it goes beyond this as well, like the example of the app, but so many of these ideas for the future of transportation that are promised as though they are going to benefit everybody don't take into account people with disabilities, right? And how that is going to impact them. And so, in the book I talk about how Uber, for example, promised it was going to revolutionize the taxi industry, and one of the key revolutions that it did in the United States was to carve itself out of the Americans with Disabilities Act by saying that it's a technology company and not a transportation company, so it doesn't need to provide service to people with wheelchairs, right? Then, of course, we have the dockless bike and scooter companies like Bird and these other ones who went into these cities, dropped these bikes and scooters on the sidewalk, and then all of a sudden disrupted it for everybody, but people with wheelchairs couldn't get by, people who had, people who were blind couldn't see these things that they were going to encounter. And there are a number of examples as well as for these new proposed delivery robots. I don't know if you've, So, this idea that there's a little bot and it's going to deliver you, your order from the fast food restaurant that you order from or whatever else. And they are also not designed with, keeping this in mind and keeping in mind how it's going to affect people. So there are a few stories I tell in the book that, some women have written about where they've described how on one case, one person was, she was in a wheelchair, she was crossing an intersection, and the light was red, she was good to go, but then when she got to the other side, there was this delivery bot sitting there, making it unable for her to get up onto the sidewalk, and then she had to go around and try to find a different way as the light changed, cars started moving, all these things, right? And another one where a woman with a seeing eye dog ran into one of these delivery bots. Her dog wasn't used to it, so it just sat down and kind of waited for it to move, but it also wasn't, It wasn't programmed to deal with that situation. And so there are all of these cases where you can see these problems because these technology companies don't think about the broader ways that their technologies, their ideas affect a whole load of different people. You know, it's a serious problem, and it causes problems for a lot of people.
Awesome, that was a great question. And we have someone in the back. Do you want to come up, or do you want to just, yeah.
Sorry, I missed the last part.
No, I would say I describe myself more as a socialist than a social democrat. Absolutely. No, I appreciate your comment. I would just say, like, on what you said before, like, just to pick up on that, I think it's really important because it's what I talk about in the book, right? For example, like, we had these transportation companies come out in the past decade and a half and tell us how they were disrupting the transportation system, right? How they were going to change everything, upend everything. And then you see what they actually did is, you know, they put a few technologies in the kind of auto-oriented transportation system that we have, but they didn't actually change a whole lot. And that's part of the reason that I go back to the early days of the automobile, right? Because it really shows what a true disruption is. And that disruption didn't happen, the entry to the automobile and remaking cities for cars by building out all these roads and highways and suburbs didn't happen just because there was a new technology. It happened because there was a set of economic interests, all of these auto companies, oil companies, et cetera, that went to the government, that used their power to lobby the government to put in place these regulations, these subsidies, these, changing the tax system in order to remake the cities, in order to change the way that development happened. And so if you actually think about what it's going to change, or what it's going to require to change things today, it's not just the invention of new technologies, so to speak, or companies that are promoting new technologies. It's actually getting the government on board to make serious changes to change the actual kind of foundation on which these different transportation systems or whatnot can be built, as you're saying, if we look to other countries.
Awesome. Thank you for your comment and your question. We welcome both. Anyone who's next? Oh, yes, please. You want to come up, or you're just going to...
So it seems like there's going to be a real push away from suggesting these public transport solutions and more if the type of vehicle you drive. Right? As the switch to EV, switch to smaller vehicles again. What do you think is the best way that's going to be tackled? It's already got momentum, but how do you
No, it's a good question. You know, I would say I'm not anti-EV, right? I think that electric vehicles are absolutely better than fossil fuel vehicles, and they're going to play a role in, you know, addressing the climate impact of the transportation system. No question about it. But then I think that we've had this narrative for a long time, and it still kind of predominates in how you hear the auto companies, the mining companies, the government talk about it, as though that, you know, this is some kind of, they'll talk about the vehicles as though they're zero emissions, right? They're kind of a green alternative to what we already have. But then when you dig into the footprint, the life cycle emissions, the actual supply chains of the vehicles, we can see that that is not the case, right? We can see that there's a lot of minerals that need to be mined in order to make these vehicles. The International Energy Agency estimates that we're going to need 4,200% more lithium extraction in order to, you know, facilitate this transition if we focus just on electric vehicles. More than 2,000% increases in cobalt and nickel. I'm sure maybe some nickel producers here in Newfoundland would like the sound of that. But I think we also need to think about, you know, the bigger impacts of what that's going to be. And so when I think about what is going to be necessary to address the climate impact of the transportation system, putting aside all the other impacts, it's really to focus not so much on can we just shift all of our fossil fuel vehicles to battery power, but rather, sure, can we make some of that shift, but how many people can we also get out of cars altogether? Because that's how you actually address the real kind of climate impact of the transportation system in a serious and sustained way.
Oscar.
Sorry. One moment there.
Happens to me all the time.
So with the introduction of EV, like electric vehicles, e-bikes, there's new e-waste that we aren't ready to deal with. How do we negotiate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And e-waste is one of those things that kind of can be out of sight and out of mind, right? Mm-hmm. You know, we throw our electronics, or we give our electronics to the dump or whatever, you know, company takes them and supposedly recycles them, and then we don't see it from there, even though they're often shipped to places in the global south that then have a lot of kind of environmental impacts as a result of that, right? And certainly we're going to see more batteries, you know, proliferating through our society as a result of this transition, and electrification is going to be a key part of addressing the climate crisis and the impact of the way we live on the climate, right? But part of that is also going to need to be developing the type of recycling that's going to be necessary to address these batteries and the proliferation of these batteries and all of these, you know, minerals in our society, so that we can reuse as much as possible, but also dispose of them in the right way, and ensure that in disposing of them, we're not just exporting that problem to other countries, but are actually dealing with it ourselves, because, you know, it is our problem that we're creating. And of course, that's one of my concerns with just focusing on EVs, is that, sure, you know, we're going to have these electric powered vehicles here, but then there's a lot of countries where the mining happens that are going to have a lot of environmental impacts, human impacts, as a result of all of the extraction that happens.
Sorry, one thing on top of that is that EVs are like heavier by nature. Collisions with them will be more, will kill more people just by how they are. So yeah.
Yep, absolutely. You know, they are heavier for the most part than you know, a regular fossil fuel vehicle of the same size and same type. One impact of that is to make them more dangerous for pedestrians, and we've already seen, you know, in the United States, I'm not sure exactly the figures in Canada right now, that pedestrian deaths have been rising recently because there are more SUVs and big trucks on the road. You know, they have the higher front ends, and so if it hits a pedestrian, it's higher up in the chest, and so that increases the chance that they...
Apologies for... I believe the new Ford F-150, or maybe the Dodge Ram, the height of the front, the hood, 5'4". So, like, a child, like, you cannot see them. Yeah. Like,
yeah, and you know, part of the issue there is, you know, part of the reason that these vehicles have gotten so much bigger over time is that the way that the fuel economy standards are developed in the United States is that larger vehicles, you know, once they reach a certain size, the type of fuel economy changes, right? So if you keep making the vehicles bigger and bigger, then you can avoid the kind of continual increases in the need to address the fuel economy, or to not address it so much. And so it's a real kind of it's a real kind of problem in the regulation with how it's written right now. There have been talks about fixing it. I'm not sure if it's happened yet. Hopefully it will. The other point I would make, though, you talked about how they're heavier. The other thing is that, when we talk about how there's zero emissions, that means that there's no tailpipe emissions from the vehicle. So they're not having that kind of climate impact, at least, directly from the source, right? But there's still the air pollution, the local air pollution that comes with that, because a lot of the local air pollution from a vehicle is not so much from the tailpipe, but rather from the tire wear, from the brake wear, from the dust that they're kicking up from the road. In the United States, that's estimated to cause over 50,000 premature deaths a year. And because the vehicles are heavier, it actually presents the possibility of that aspect of it getting worse. And so I think that's another concern to have there too.
Plus
and it's not just the anti-EV particularly, but yeah.
Go ahead, ask it.
No.
Okay. Just to sort of circle back to disability for a second as well. People who, and there are 22,000 of us in this province alone who live with significant sight loss. So not a small group, right? The way we navigate is hourly. And if I could count the number of times that I was nearly hit by a vehicle, but for the fact I heard it coming, it really concerns me. On one hand, I'm 100% behind anything that minimizes our use of fossil fuels in any way, but I'm really, really worried about the relative quietness of e-vehicles. And I don't think anybody except people who actually are afraid of it are thinking about it.
Yeah.
That I know of.
No, I completely agree with you. And, just to note that there are ongoing, kind of regulatory discussions about that. There were, some people proposed that you would be able to choose your own sound for the EV. But in the United States, they've recently said no, that's not going to happen. So luckily, that gets stopped in its tracks, or hopefully, that gets stopped in its tracks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Vanessa.
Yeah, it doesn't. The book doesn't look so much at shipping networks and what goes on with supply chains. But when we do look at electric vehicles, when we look at any vehicles, like we've seen during the pandemic, how it's become a lot harder for people to buy cars. If you go up Kemount Road, you can see how so many of the lots don't have many vehicles actually available there. You'll have some waiting times if you're looking for a vehicle right now. So that completely disrupted the supply chains of the auto industry as well as so many other industries, right? That's not going to change with EVs. It will just kind of rearrange the supply chains and how they're currently set up, because rather than needing fossil fuels to go to the gas station or some of the other parts or products that go into cars as they're put together right now, you're going to need a lot more minerals that are going to come from different parts of the world. Whether it's lithium from South America or Australia, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are so many other examples, right? And so it will kind of, depending on how that shakes out, depending on where all the minerals come from, it will rearrange the supply chains. But that global supply chain is still going to be there, and certainly that still contains kind of, I guess, risks for the future or vulnerabilities for whatever approach that we end up taking.
Awesome. So many good questions, comments. We got another one from the back.
A number of years ago, I read a book by Marx, this mirror that described the 14th century. She was trying to make the point that the 14th century, which was born by plague, was one of the worst centuries that man lived through. And I was living in Stevenville at the time. Really, I bought the book, and it struck me that growing up in Branch in the 40s, primitive little community, that there was more change in society in the 40 years from 1950s, 1990s, and there was the previous several hundred years, which sort of made the point that society is not evolving. There's a revolution going on in terms of change. Certainly, I feel privileged personally that I lived through that change. I don't think any other generation of people ever lived through the kind of change that I've experienced growing up from to today, technology and so on. And with all that in mind, and with that runaway train of revolution now, not evolution, I'll ask you, don't you think you're a bit of a voice crying in the wilderness? And you just change that.
Certainly feels that way sometimes. No, I appreciate the comment and the question. Yeah, you know, especially with a lot of the work I do on technology as well, you know, it's really kind of going against the grain in certain ways, in the sense that there's a desire, especially when it comes to these new technologies, just to, you know, accept what they're delivering, to accept that it's going to be beneficial, and not really to question it, right? And, you know, I don't have much of a doubt that that's still going to continue to a certain degree, right? But I hope that part of my contribution is at least to get people to think a bit more critically about what's happening, so that instead of just, you know, uncritically embracing some new technological change or whatever is being pushed on us, that, you know, we can at least try to ensure that it's benefiting people and that we're kind of sawing off the hard edges of it, so to speak, and that we kind of minimize the harms and maximize the gains that we can get out of it. You know, it's not to say that we shouldn't change things or that we shouldn't seek to think about how society can work differently or to see it work differently. But to think about who's benefiting from those changes and to ensure that as many people as possible are seeing those benefits, rather than just, you know, I guess a smaller number of people.
Awesome. Teacher.
So I work with the municipal sector across the province, and I would say that there are a lot of leaders who really want to make change, but they need support and guidance in how to figure that out. I'll also say that, you know, it's an interesting space for the public right now. I think we have a general culture of complacency here for a variety of reasons. So you talk about how to mobilize, and I guess my question is, what kind of policy levers, evidence-based things do we need here in this province to help that mobilization, understanding that we have such a culture of complacency? How do we help leaders lead?
It's a great question, and a big question. And, you know,
I hope you have all the answers.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah. No, I appreciate the question, of course. You know, I think, as I was talking about before, I think part of it is also to kind of change the way that we think about transportation, and to change the way that, and to change what we think is actually possible, right? As you're talking about, I would agree that there's a lot of complacency, and there's a lot of, you know, this is the way that things are, you know, why should we change them? You know, things are generally working, or even when they're not working, you know, at least they might be better than somewhere else. And so, you know, I think that there are a lot of people, luckily, who are doing that work to try to put those ideas out there. You know, who are hopefully helping to change that conversation. You know, I think that there are people on even, you know, city council here in St. John's who I find inspiring with their ability to push different ideas for how the city should work. You know, pushing how should be better. But I think that there's also a need to go beyond the additional municipalities and try to get more of those ideas within the provincial government, because I think that ultimately, you know, making those changes is going to require some degree of provincial funding, right, to help make that possible, because really they have the revenue tools that a lot of municipalities don't. And so I don't know if it fully answers your question, but yeah, I think that there are definitely opportunities, and part of that is thinking about what is actually possible and what we can actually do in our communities and see change, rather than just having them stay the way that they are right now, and then trying to turn those into achievable policy goals in a way that maybe doesn't happen so much right now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Amazing. So many good questions and comments. We are almost out of time, but if anyone has any final thing they've been holding on to, this is your opportunity. Yes.
Can you explain the tech really?
Woo!
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. I think I'd have to go with my my not so good buddy Elon Musk. He's someone I've been writing about for quite a long time. I think that especially when we look at the book and the topic of transportation, he's done a lot to put some bad ideas out there. And especially given what's going on right now with him, I think it's fair to say Elon Musk.
Awesome. Well, let's give it up for Paris. And I will say, if anyone feels really inspired by this conversation and wants to get involved in improving our public transit system, the Social Justice Cooperative of Newfoundland and Labrador has an action team specifically around challenging car culture. So they've been advocating for clearing the sidewalks in the winter and improving the Metrobus and making our city more accessible. So definitely you can find them on Google, or you can chat with folks here like Anne. And so if you want to have any more questions, let us know. All right, thank you all for coming out.
Thanks, everyone.
Did you stream it on Facebook or something?
Yeah.
Under what?